Chapter 16, the Fiscal Policy and Government Budget. I often used to wonder when the government announces its budget, how does it matter to me? Until I read this chapter, now I am much more informed as to how does the government's annual budget impact how the country works, and what does it mean that the government annual budget is equal to the fiscal policy. So with this chapter, we're going to learn about that. So fiscal policy is another way in which you can simulate the economy. We have seen so far monetary policies. I think until chapter 15, it was mainly monetary policy. But fiscal policy is another big way in which the government can impact the overall output through government spending and through the income taxes that the government collects. So the fiscal policy has two parts. How much does the government spend and how much does the government make? The government makes money by collecting taxes. So if the government spends more than what it makes, then you are under this situation where you are in a deficit. So let's look at first, what are the spending that the government does? The government spends on building roads, schools, and it does a lot of these purchases. National defense systems, it spends on the military, it spends on so many things. These are the government purchases. And it also spends a lot of money on entitlements, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are transfers. So that constitutes government spending, and the taxes, the personal income tax that you and I pay, and the corporate tax, that is part of the income. That's how they make money. So if the spending is greater than the income, if the spending is greater than the income, then they are under deficit. But if it's less than the income or the taxes that they collect, then we're under surplus. I believe in the last 30 years, there was only 1 year when the United States was in surplus. I think around 1990s during the Clinton administration. So deficit is going to be important. So we have to really go into deficits. I'm not going to talk more about surplus because that rarely happens. So we need to find out, like, what about deficit? How does the government serve? How does the government make up that extra money to spend on so many of these costly initiatives when it doesn't have the income? So the government, to serve the deficit, it needs money. So what it does, it issues bonds. It says, hey, I'm going to raise money from three types of people. Local people saying, hey, United States residents, I'm going to issue you bonds in the primary market. Take the bond, I'll pay you some interest, and you give me your money. So then use that money to do all of the spending. It also, if the local people don't want to buy, they're like, no, this is very less interest, or I have enough bond, or I don't want to buy more bonds. And then the government can go to its own agency, the central bank, the Federal Reserve. Say, hey, Federal Reserve, give me money. So the Federal Reserve buys the bonds, government bonds, and gives the government money. So the government agency buys government's bonds and gives money. So the way it does it, it has to print money. The Federal Reserve prints money. By printing money, what it's doing is essentially, think about it, it's going to cause inflation. So let's say there was only $100 in the United States. Total Federal Reserve had issued $100. And then the government says, hey, I need $10 more because I'm $10 shy. I'm $10 in deficit. So the central bank then prints $10 more. So you and I are part of that 100 original dollars where we collectively own the United States $100. But because the Federal Reserve just printed $10 more, our value of what we hold with that $100 is now diluted by 10%. Right? So that is inflation, intuitively. What happens is that 10% is actually going to be diluted. Your money, even though you think it's safe sitting in the bank, it just got diluted by the inflation amount that the money was printed in. Because think about it, $100, let's say it could buy one pizza. Now the same one pizza, now you have to pay $110. Poor example of a pizza, but you get it, right? $100 total United States could buy one pizza. Now it will take $110 to buy the same pizza. So someone else got the $10, 10%, and your $100 now all of a sudden is 90% worth it, right? It's equivalent to 90%. So your money just gets diluted sitting in the bank. Very important. That was the biggest learning I had. It's like I always thought, hey, my money's sitting in the bank, that should be okay. Why do I need to buy bonds? But no, you're actually losing money. When the central bank, the Federal Reserve, issues more money, prints money, your inflation, via inflation, the inflation tax, your money's value is getting diluted. So if your money is not working, it is getting diluted. Big learning. And then the third issuer of the buyer of the bond is the foreigners. The Chinese have eventually 3 trillion plus of the US securities, either in the terms of treasuries or bonds. So foreigners can also say, hey, I'm gonna buy your bonds because I think you're safe. I think you will actually give me the interest. So that's how the deficit is served. People buy bonds because they want to hedge against this inflation tax, or a lot of people like me do not understand this because they didn't read this chapter. They just lose money. The bank money is being lost. The savings that they get from the savings bank account is very, very low, typically much lower than the inflation. And the foreigners, right? So that's how the deficit is served. Very interesting, right? And now, let's say this was year one that you had that $10 deficit. But what if every year you have $10 deficit? Like every year you come back and say, hey, my social security needs are much higher because my demographics have changed, the number of workers have reduced, the number of people are increasing in terms of the ones that are claiming for my social security, they're living longer, and so many things. My expenses are going up. So then what happens is the deficit moves into, the deficit is a flow. Every year there's a new deficit, right? But then it keeps adding to this stock called the debt. This is big. Government debt. So collection of historically all your deficits that you have not paid back is equal to your debt. So your $10 deficit just got added to this debt. Think about this as your balance sheet. It just gets added. Your balance sheet just balloons. And this debt, could be held by the central bank, the government. The United States government owns this debt. Right? So $10 in year one, another $20 in year two, so it becomes 30. You have another $30 is 60. So your debt keeps rising. So when your debt keeps rising, you can also say, hey, my debt's rising, but I'm also producing more. So then there's this ratio called debt to GDP. If, let's say, you're taking debt at $10 every year, but then your GDP is increasing $40 every year, meaning you're producing much more, then this debt to GDP is going to go down, because you're like, even though you're spending more, you're actually earning more. So your debt to GDP improves if your GDP is better. So this ratio, how much debt you have versus your GDP, is an important ratio that measures a country's indebtedness to all of these holders of that debt. So a high debt to GDP ratio, if this keeps going up, meaning you're not actually producing more, you're actually just borrowing, right? Then private investors just lose interest in that country. They're like, hey, this effect's called crowding out, where private investors just stay out. They're like, no, I'm better off not investing in this country. And so then what happens is that when investors go out, the capital formation, the investments that need to be made in the country's infrastructure, the schools, all that continues to go down. The capital formation goes down. And also when you have a high debt to GDP ratio, remember the Eurozone crisis that we've covered in the previous chapters, what happens? Italy and Spain. Remember that? Eurozone. German bond yields were going down, but interest rate on Spain and others kept going up because Greece, remember? Greece interest rate on bonds, that just kept going up. They had to pay much more interest to issue bonds. And so a high debt to GDP ratio increases your interest rate on your bond. You have to pay more interest to issue the same bond. And so when that happens, this has a spiraling effect because now you're going to pay interest, which is at a much higher rate. So if you don't produce more, your debt to GDP ratio will get worse. So this is the debt spiral. This is a debt spiral. If you do not figure out how to produce more, your debt will get harder and harder to service. So now you see how the deficit leads to debt and GDP. So then the question is, let's not worry about debt because we can take care of the GDP. So how do you increase the GDP? Again, fiscal policy has two ways to increase the GDP. Number one, reduce taxes. So if you reduce taxes, see here, expansionary fiscal policy. You reduce taxes, what happens? When you reduce taxes, your long-run aggregate supply increases. So what's the intuition behind this? If let's say taxes on corporations are reduced, then they just have more money. They didn't anticipate having that more money, so they're going to start to build more factories with that extra money because now they have this opportunity to take this advantage of tax benefit. When they build more of those factories, they can supply more. So when they supply more, your LRAS curve, right, goes from here to here, which I'll get to it later, but your long-run aggregate supply increases. Capital formation increases, more factories are built, more goods and services can be built. And when that happens, eventually your aggregate supply also moves. Not just your long-run aggregate, but also your short-term aggregate supply moves to the right. And so when that happens, when more and more of these activities happen, those new factories need people to build those factories. So they're going to charge more money. The people are going to, hey, you want my services? And I'm in demand because you need to build so many of these factories. They're going to ask for more wages. And so all of that leads to higher inflation because everyone is doing well. And so there's more competition for the same goods and services. Inflation goes up. Also aggregate demand goes up, right? Because those people who just got more money building those factories, they're going to go spend. So the aggregate demand goes up. So you see how tax cuts increase the supply and demand curves, and overall GDP or the output goes up. We've seen a lot of this in the previous videos, but I'm going to still summarize it here. But let's stay with me for now. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand goes up, GDP goes up. If GDP goes up, much higher than the debt, you're covered. So that is the overall fiscal policy as to how taxes improve your aggregate output. I also told you there are two, right? So the second one, government purchases. So if the government starts to purchase more, right? Says, hey, I'm going to build these roads and school, and it starts to spend more. When it spends more, same thing happens. It needs people to build those roads. It needs infrastructure, needs raw materials. Inflation goes up, aggregate demand goes up. Again, long-run aggregate supply didn't go up because the government's directly funneling through. Same effect, GDP increases. Is there a contrarian view to this fancy diagram, right? I had to draw this twice to get to this simplicity. Hopefully, this makes sense. There is one view called the Ricardian equivalent. I think it's based on this person who shared two insights. One was, hey, when you cut taxes, people are smart. They are future looking. They understand that, hey, you're cutting taxes now, but you're going to increase the taxes in the future. So they are future looking. People are future looking, and then they discount all of these things. They're like, hey, I need to save more. So they start saving more in anticipation of the future taxes. So that private saving goes up. And they're like, hey, I'm not going to spend more because I need to be ready for the future taxes. So that aggregate demand doesn't change, inflation doesn't change, and they're like, hey, none of this works actually, because people are forward looking. This is controversial through some of the examples in the chapter because of three big reasons. A lot of people, like, think about this. I have been in the education system, I've been in working class. I still didn't know any of this, right? As to how this works. So for me to understand that, hey, my future taxes are going to increase, I think for a lot of people, it will be hard to understand unless they know all of the systems, how it works. So I think this view that people are forward looking, that they understand the economics so very well, I think it's a hard call, because a lot more in-depth understanding is needed of all of these subjects, which I don't think a lot of people know, right? So I think that the myopia of that, hey, I now have extra money, I'm gonna go spend, it's gonna be, I think, more of a probable situation, because they don't understand. A lot of people might not understand how the system works, what is inflation. I didn't understand that my money's value was losing staying in the bank account until today, right? So I think the education on this area is low, and so I think, and this I may be totally wrong, but I think that people's savings will not go up. They'll actually go down. When they have more money, they'll spend the money. So that's one challenge to this. The second piece is a lot of people who might have borrowing constraints, and they might have the view that, hey, my future is looking bright, so I want to spend money, but they can't spend because they don't have the right income at this point. But they do know if after 5 years their income's going to go up, but they can't buy the house that they want to buy. All of a sudden you give them tax cuts, they can actually go spend that money, they can invest in what they want to invest. So I think the investments will go up, aggregate demand will go up, inflation will go up. So I think there are multiple reasons why it supports that this view actually works much more for me instead of the Ricardian view. But there is this contrarian view, and it's important. Another thing is, like, every year the Fed, the government announces its budgets. It's very interesting to look at where the federal budget is getting the money from in terms of taxes and other things, and where is it spending, right? As you find out something really interesting. Transfers, like 50% of the federal budget. States, 44% in income is from production, right? But taxes is 44% for Federal Reserve, but very little for state. And so understanding the dynamics as to how these transfers are increasing, that, hey, this is a ticking time bomb, that's actually because of demographics, it's actually getting worse, and much more than Social Security is Medicare and Medicaid. Currently 5 to 6% of the total spend, expected to be in 2050 to be around 15%, 10 to 15%. That's like huge. So I think understanding where is the money spent in the national defense versus schools versus roads will get us a better understanding of what are the priorities. How is it going to increase the GDP, or how is it going to actually kickstart the cycle, or is it actually not doing anything, right? So understanding the government budget, the fiscal policy, is super critical to understand the bigger picture of where the country is heading. Because if you do have high debt to GDP ratio, then you know that, hey, you're getting into this debt spiral. You have so many countries that you can study that says, hey, look, this is hard. But if you have governments who are not willing to take any risk on their country to actually take them out of this debt spiral, they're not balancing their budget, that's a problem. That can lead to sovereign debt crisis, where the country just defaults. And so it becomes very hard for that country in future to, again, issue bonds, because there's debt intolerance, wherein people feel like, hey, I don't want to be buying this country's bond because I've been burned once. So again, there are many things that to learn from fiscal policy as to how it impacts where the government's spending the money, what is the ways in which the government's actually trying to get the country out of this debt spiral, because these are big loops. if the country has a debt spiral, that could lead to huge unemployment because it's very hard for you to service your debt, so you're going to cut your production. But when you cut your production, there'll be civil unrest, there'll be protests, and the political parties will change, saying, hey, look, this is a problem. So all of this is very, very critical. You can't even raise taxes because no one's working as much as they used to before. But you can also have a positive loop. There's also positive loop of how when you balance your budget, you can actually get out of this, right? So let's look at some of those examples and move into something more specific. We look through the long term. This is the long term as to how things change, but also short term. There are two concepts to keep in mind. One is the expenditure multiplier, right? So if this is the path of expense, right? Like the government spends money. If the government spends money, this is where the expenditure multiplier happens. What this is saying is here. If the government spends $1 trillion today, it gets back. If it spends $1 trillion today here, it gets back 2.5 trillion. So the expenditure of 1 trillion got them 2.5 trillion in output. So that's the expenditure multiplier. And there's also a tax multiplier, right? So this loop here. So $1 trillion increase in taxes reduces output by 1.5 trillion, right? So, Keynesian side of people, they think that, hey, tax multiplier is higher than expense multiplier. So I still don't fully understand which one is true, but the textbook has these two examples where the expenditure multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier. And for a given country, what is the situation? That would be an interesting question. It's like, hey, which one's bigger? Right? So once we understand where's the money spent and what's the return on investment, 1.5 to 2.5 versus 1 here leads to a reduction in 1.5 output, right? So, but vice versa. If you cut taxes, if you have 1 trillion in tax cuts, you get 1.5 output positive, right? So the reason why that works that way is, look at this. When the government increases their purchases, G increases, inflation increases. I just told you, people will ask for more money. And when that happens, interest rate has to go up, right? The MP curve. And when interest rate goes up, investment goes down. And so the output increases by a small amount. But when you have the zero lower bound, which we've seen in the previous videos, when the Federal Reserve hits the zero lower bound, which it has been in 2020 and 2021 and for a long time now, the impact of government purchases is much higher on output, because when inflation increases, interest rates actually falls when it has to increase, because it said real interest rates will go from -2 to -1, right? So it's actually falling, and so the investments go up, output go up big time, right? So instead of 1 to 2, it goes from 1 dash to 2 dash, right? So it's a good understanding to know how government spending in the short run is impacted. And let's look at taxes again. When you increase taxes, when you cut taxes, aggregate supply goes down, aggregate demand goes up, output goes up, right? But there's this other side of people called the supplier side, who really think that not just this, but also the long run aggregate supply shifts from LRAS1 to LRAS2, so the output is increased and magnified big times. So I just walked you through all of these individual graphs I've covered in the previous videos, just trying to connect the dots as to how all of this actually adds up here. And so fiscal deficit reduction, right? Hey, if you're in this mess, how do you get out of this, right? So the way is to balance your budget, one way. But you might be in a situation where your country is actually suffering. A lot of people are cutting shop, closing shop. So this may not be the ideal way for you, but one way is to say, hey, I'm going to balance my budget. Meaning, I'm going to give the other people give the signal that, hey, my country is not going to default, and I'm not going to go into this debt spiral. And so what do? You reduce your spending, increase your taxes, if possible, right? Because sometimes increasing taxes beyond a certain point, you can even let's say your country is your patient and is in ICU, you're going to cut off the oxygen. That's what increasing taxes could do. But you have to know what your situation is. But if you could reduce your spending, increase your taxes, what happens? Your budget is now balanced. When your budget is balanced, people get the signal that, hey, there's a very low chance that there's going to be a default in this country. And so the interest rate goes down because they're like, hey, this country is now prudent. I can buy their bonds at even a lower rate because they're actually on a better path, right? So the signal reduces interest rate. Demand goes up because people are like, hey, my future taxes are not going to be high because they already increased my taxes, so hopefully they'll stay here. So the demand goes up, people spend more. Investment goes up, output goes up, right? So balancing budget can be expansionary too. So how you do this, how do you play this for your country, knowing deeply about your country is very critical, right? And knowing the fact that, hey, deficit is nothing but issuance of new bonds. And new bonds is nothing but like, hey, what people own or the central bank, and how central bank is nothing but the money supply. And how, inflation actually goes hand in hand. The rate and growth of inflation is same as rate and growth of money supply. Really insightful to understand how the fiscal policy impacts output, impacts aggregate demand in the long run, also in the short run. All right, champions. Thank you.